I got my sports shirt on because this is like a gym workout. It's so hot. Okay, so this is our third video lecture for day one of our online research, qualitative research methodology residential school. And in this video, you'll learn how to prepare for your interview for your online interview. Preparing for your interview. So, preparing for your interview. This is what it's all about. You know, the first thing we need to do when preparing for our interview is think about the context. It's at this point we need to make some distinctions between face-to-face and online interviews. If I were giving you advice on how to conduct an individual face-to-face interview, I would say that the effectiveness of your interview is determined by your attending to your interviewee. And you can do that by making sure the interview context communicates your attendance, as well as through listening and responding to your participant. To make sure the interview context communicates your attendance, you want to set it up in such a way that it gives the best opportunity for you to interact with the participant. You want to make sure that it's scheduled at a time that suits the participant and that it is held in a location that shows you're wanting to listen to the participant's thoughts. You know, don't hold your interview in a nightclub, for example. And you want to have pre-tested your recording equipment and be familiar enough with it so that it appears you know what you're doing, i.e. that recording the interview was important enough a thing for you to do that you spent time making sure that you could do it well. So get all of that right and you'll be communicating to your interviewee that you are attentive, that you're going to listen to them. You are going to be attentive to their thoughts. Now, in an online interview, you don't have a room to set up or location to arrange, and you don't have much control over the room the participant's in. You don't have any control, really. But you still need to think very carefully about setting up the interview. The first thing you need to be aware of is how online interviewing impacts eye contact. The big problem is that most people use a webcam that sits on top of their screen, and that this means that when we're looking at the image of a person's face on screen, we're not actually looking into the camera. You know, we're actually looking below them. We're looking down there. You can't really get around that unless you have a webcam that's placed at quite a distance from you. But then if it's a webcam on your laptop, you're probably using your laptop's microphone. You know, if I was to be over here, just say, you probably can't hear me now. This is the problem with the microphone. If I'm over here, I'm actually looking just below the camera, but it looks as though I'm looking at you. You know? But then you're going to have your mic, an external mic, rigged up so that you can actually, your audio is okay. I can't work a bar stool. So where were we? Okay, so yeah, you could be a long way, you move away from your camera. That fixes some of the problems with eye contact, but then you're too far away from your microphone to be heard. You could also go in for a full studio rig. Something like I'm using, a teleprompter, that you could rig it up so that actually you're looking at the person on screen, but you're looking at the camera, which is behind a teleprompter. But don't worry about all of this stuff. This is really not worth the effort, largely because people are used to that odd eye contact thing now. Mostly people are used to it. You know, when video conferencing, people are used to the fact that they're not looking at you, but they're looking down at their screen. And it's not that disruptive. You know, the fact that you're looking down at someone's chest rather than in their eyes, you know, they understand it's the context of where the webcam is and where the screen is. You know, the problem is women are quite used to having men looking down at their chest when they're talking to them. Okay, but here is something you can do. You can do something about that, which is a good thing to do, which is avoid having your webcam below your eye level. Stick your laptop up on some books, something to bring your webcam level with your eye line so that you're not looking down on someone when you're interviewing them. You know, if you've got your laptop down here and you're looking down at the screen, you're looking down on someone. It's not a huge issue, but it's a subtle one. The thing is that our visual language is used to interpret someone who appears above us in a camera angle we interpret that as that person has dominance. It's a thing that they use in TV and cinema, camera angles. If they want to show that someone is powerful, then they'll stick the camera down and look up. So it's part of our visual language. It's not going to be a big thing, but people understand the context that you're on a laptop and the laptop's sitting down on your lap, where a laptop should be, so you're looking down. But it's nice if you can break that, because the visual style of looking directly at someone can have a nice subtle effect that you're actually meeting as equals. But it's not a big thing, as I say. So not a big issue. But if you wanted to make those slight little improvements, you could do that. Now, scheduling still holds as an issue for online interviewing, but with location, you don't choose your participant's location, but you do choose your own. Think about where you conduct your interview from. All the same rules apply in terms of it being a room that's suitable for listening. So you want to be a quiet room, but many of us end up interviewing from our homes. And in that case, make sure you can take care with your background. So make sure it's a quiet room. Now, most of us end up interviewing from our own homes. And in that case, make sure you take care with your background. Only show what you want to show, and don't make your background too distracting for an interview. I think mine's a bit too distracting. I was going to use my green screen, but I didn't have time. So you don't want to distract your interviewee. You want the interviewee to be focused in on the conversation. One thing to think about that you generally don't have to think about for a face-to-face meeting is lighting. If you're on webcam, the image quality tends to be really poor if your lighting is poor. And that's because webcams have tiny little sensors that can't pick up much light. So if it's dark, it gets all grainy and a bit pixelated. So you want to have plenty of light. So light coming from a window. Be careful, don't sit with a window behind you if it's bright outside, because then you'll just be a dark shadow. So try sitting either facing a window, so the window is behind your laptop, or a window to one side, bringing light in on you. Generally, it's a good idea to have a lot of light on you, but not too much light that you're just overexposed. But try playing around with light to see if that helps with the way that your image looks. What I'd do is I would always experiment with the webcam beforehand. So just do a few mock Zoom interviews and just see how you appear on camera, and see if you can play around with the lighting to improve the way the image looks, and play around with what's in the background to also make that look interesting but not distracting, and also not embarrassing. The main point really is you want to give the impression that you've actually given this interview a bit of thought. You've taken a bit of care. It's important to you, and you've got these things right. That you've put a bit of care and attention into these things, that it matters. This interview matters to you. And that is a good impression to give. Also, if you're on Wi-Fi, keep a good line of sight between your computer and your modem. And if you can, wire up your laptop through the Ethernet cable. Not a big thing, but it'll mean that the internet connection is more stable and probably stronger. And everything really relies on the quality of your internet connection when you're doing an online video. And finally, make sure you're completely familiar with your teleconference. Okay, so this is a bit embarrassing. Just as I was getting to the point when I was going to remind you to make sure that your equipment was recording, the recording failed on mine. And I only found that out when I was editing part 3. So I'm back. Doesn't make much sense to you, because if I hadn't told you these things and I'd worn the same shirt, there would have been a continuity. I'm not sure if the lighting would have, I think the lighting changed. Anyway, so make sure you check your stuff's recording. My excuse is the heat. It corrupted my file. That's what happened. Okay, the other thing is, I don't know what's happening today, but my house is squeaking. So if you hear squeaks, I don't know where they're coming from. I didn't know a house could squeak, but apparently mine has found the ability to squeak. Okay, so let's crack on. So, As I was saying, make sure you're completely familiar with your teleconferencing software and make sure your microphone is working well and that you know how to record the session. Yeah. I know. Let's move on. But it's particularly important for our assessment, and I'll tell you more about that tomorrow, all about assessment 1. Timing and scheduling. So the key principle that guides timing and scheduling is to make participating as easy as possible for your participant. You know, people are giving up their time to be part of your study. It's not only a generous thing to do, it may also be an anxiety-provoking thing for your participants to do. You know, participants are likely not familiar with being interviewed or with research in general, or they may previously have had a negative experience with research. And one way we can make participating as easy as possible is in our timing of interviews. It's important to negotiate a time that's convenient for the participant and to allow plenty of time for the interview itself, but also for preliminary and closing processes. It's important that the interviewee doesn't feel rushed, and this helps put people at ease and lets them know that they are valued. It also ensures that you have enough time to collect the rich data that you'll need for your study. And it's also important to make interviewing as easy as possible for yourself as well. So this means not over-scheduling interviews. The authors of the textbook, I think they recommend 1 per day. Now, that's pretty ideal, especially for beginning researchers. It allows you to manage fatigue because good interviews require intense focus, which can be really tiring, really draining. If you did more than 1 a day, then you might start misasking questions. Fatigue will start setting in. You're not quite as sharp as you would ordinarily be. You might forget to follow up on points that are raised in the interviews because the content of different sessions all start to mix in your mind. And you may also not have enough time to reflect on your questions or adjust them for your next interview because you're rushing from one interview to the next. So if you make any mistakes in the first interview, you don't have any time to learn from them, ready for your second interview. So generally, 1 a day. Once you get more experience with research interviews, you could perhaps take on 3 or 4 a day. It's not a good idea to do more than that in my experience. But although 1 a day is ideal, this isn't always realistic. You know, it depends on your study timelines. In Danielle Every's post-bushfire research, not the recent bushfires, but the ones before the big ones we had in 2019-2020, they generally did between 3 to 5 interviews a day, which included driving out to and between fire-affected properties. Now, they did that over a 3 to 5 day period. That's probably pushing things a bit. That's the upper limits of interview scheduling, I would say. This advice, by the way, is the same for online interviewing as it is for face-to-face interviewing. Okay, you don't have to drive to different interview settings, but the principles still stand. It's still quite tiring. It's a tiring thing to do. So be gentle with yourselves. Now let's get back to the issue of location because there are some obvious differences here between face-to-face and online interviews. Unlike face-to-face interviews, in an online interview you don't negotiate the interview location with a participant. For a face-to-face interview, there are issues of safety you need to consider, particularly bearing in mind if the location is a person's home or private space that you're not familiar with. Then you need to think about your personal safety. So if you can't meet in a public setting, you should get yourself a safety buddy, someone you let know where you'll be and how long you'll be, and instructions on what to do if you don't report back in the time you said you'd report back. Now, safe places to meet in public are things like your university campus, a library, community centre or cafe. Now, the drawback with a cafe is that it must be quiet enough for you to record in. So if you're having a face-to-face meeting, and if you're having it at your location, you would organise some simple refreshments. Make sure you've got water and glasses and maybe offer to participants tea or coffee and so on. If you're meeting in a cafe, you should buy the participant a coffee. Coffee? You should buy the participant either a coffee or coffee, depending on what they want. But remember to take your wallet, as it's embarrassing if your participant ends up having to shout you a coffee. And another thing to think about with interviewing in cafes is the cafe closing time. You don't want to be booted out halfway through. They don't. The cafe closes and you have to stop your interview. You would also have, if you're doing face-to-face interviews, you'd carry with you a little kit that includes tissues, particularly if it's a research topic that's sensitive or potentially upsetting. And get some tissues to catch those tears, just in case people get upset. It's a nice thing to do, nice thing to have. Now, with online interviews, none of that really applies. Instead, you need to think about your own location and make sure it's comfortable for you and free from distractions, and that it's sufficiently private. It needs to be a quiet environment to ensure you can make a good audio recording of the interview. But you also have to be aware of the participant's location. Is it private for them? You can't see everything that's happening in their environment. You don't know if there are other people in the room off camera, and you may not be aware if someone comes into the room. So you need to check with the participant if they have enough privacy, and to alert you if someone is there and if they don't want the questions to get too personal, Also, if the interviewee tells you someone has just walked in to the room, treat that as a signal to check on privacy issues and modify your questions if required, so as to stay away from things that might be sensitive to talk about in front of others. Now, the other thing you have to think about, more than in face-to-face interviews when you're doing an online interview, those things I referred to before about eye contact issues and the background you're showing in your video and the lighting in your room. Now, let's talk about recording. You've got to record your interview, because qualitative research is interested in rich detail. We need to be able to precisely record what people say so as to not miss a single word of it. In a face-to-face interview, you'd have to think about the quality of your microphone, the quality of your recording device, the positioning of your recording device and your microphone, and think about ways to avoid background noise interfering with your recording. Needs a bit of thought. You'd be surprised. It's not that simple, actually. It takes a little bit of thought. For example, if you're recording on your phone with an app on your phone, don't just put your phone on a desk to record the conversation or a table. You need to put the phone on something soft, like a jumper or a cushion, to stop vibrations coming through the table, like you or the interviewee tapping the desk with their foot or tapping the desk with their hand. The microphone will pick up all of that. It'll go straight through the microphone from the table. So you need something soft between the microphone and the table to cushion those vibrations. Those vibrations can ruin a recording, by the way. Also, ideally, you'd want an external microphone of some sort, that picks up both your voices, you and your interviewee. And you need to aim for the best quality recording you can get, and you should always practice recording in environments that are similar to the one that you're going to have your interview in, just to check the audio is going to be good enough. And testing your microphone from different distances and different voice volumes. So all of this applies for face-to-face interviewing, but for online interviewing, it's a little less complicated in some ways because you've got a lot more control over the recording at your end, but it's a lot harder because you have very little control of the recording at your interviewee's end. So if the audio is bad because they're using a poor quality mic or they're using the microphone off their laptop, there's ways you can improve the audio, but you need to know your software. You need to know how you can tweak your software and give instructions to your interviewee to improve the quality of the sound that's coming through from their device. So look up on that. Do some practice runs with people using that conference software that you're using. In our instance, it's going to be Zoom for our interviews. Now, if the audio is just too dreadful coming from their end, you have to take notes on what participant says, rather than rely on the recording. So you let the recording record, you record it, but you keep notes, and that should be enough for you to fill in the gaps of the things you can't hear from the recording. But make sure you fill in those gaps soon after the interview. Consider transcribing that interview from the recording, because if you do that transcribing straight after the interview, you'll be able to fill in the gaps you can't quite hear from the recording. You'll catch as much as you possibly can, in spite of the poor quality of the recording. And if you don't do that, if you leave it a few days or a week, by the time you get to the recording, you just will have forgotten the conversation, you can't fill in the gaps, and it'll be really frustrating for you. Really, you just have to do everything you can, your end, to make sure the recording is as good as it possibly can be. Test your microphone, go into the software settings, know how to fix things through the software settings, and so on. Now, as with face-to-face interviews, you need to keep a discreet eye on your software to make sure it's recording. Just be discreet, You also need to get consent from the interviewee prior to recording the interview. So you'd ordinarily be doing that at the start of the interview in the consent procedure to verbally remind the participant, and again seek consent at the start of the interview for the interview to proceed and for you to record the interview. And if the participant is worried about being recorded at any point, just turn the recording off and make notes instead. For face-to-face interviews, you should make sure you have a fully charged device and spare batteries. Fully charged recording device and spare batteries for it. Now, with online recording, it's less of a problem when you're using video conferencing, but if you're doing that through your laptop, make sure your laptop is fully charged and plugged in. It's always a good idea, if you can, to have 2 recording devices, one to be used as backup when you're doing face-to-face interviews. Not such an issue for online interviews. And again, face-to-face, you would have to pay close attention to where your microphone is located, less so for online, but make sure you're close enough to your laptop microphone, or better still, use an external plug-in microphone and remind your participant to get close to the microphone their end as well. Now, to finish this video, I've mentioned note-taking a few times as a backup if you have a bad recording, but you need to be aware of some of the disadvantages of note-taking. You can actually miss rich detail when you're note-taking because you're busy taking your notes, and it's hard to write as quickly as people speak. So you'll inevitably be missing things. It's also really difficult to develop and maintain rapport if you're looking down at a notepad all the time, taking your notes. Now, being online, you can get away with this partially as you're sat in front of the laptop. You can type as the person is speaking, but mostly that won't be noticeable. But it will be kind of obvious that you're not just listening to the participant, that something else is going on, that your concentration is not wholly on that person, that you're also thinking about something else. It'll become really apparent. If you don't have your microphone muted, they'll also hear the tapping of the keyboard, so be aware of that. Generally, it's not a good idea to be typing while someone's speaking. When the participant stops talking, it'll be obvious that you're busy typing away, and the interaction can quickly become quite stilted. It's okay to make a few notes during the interview, just those little reminders you need to make for yourself about things you might want to ask later on in the interview. Just don't do it too frequently, and tell the participant when you're doing it so that they know what's going on. They'll make sense of why occasionally you look a little bit distracted. Now, as much as possible, you need to give your interviewee your undivided attention. Once the interview is finished and you're offline, it's a very good idea to make some contemporaneous notes after the interview to capture as much as you can about the interview. Include ideas the conversation gave you about areas of analysis, reflection on the interview process, and so on. This is really good stuff to do to capture as much about the interview as you possibly can once the interview is finished. Okay, now our final video for this lecture series is coming up soon. That one is all about how to actually conduct your interview. So till then, ta-da.